37.6 million ounces of silver disappeared in just 47 days. Not transferred, not hedged, not shuffled in digital ledgers, removed physically from the COMEX vaults. A silent drain, the fastest since 1980, the year silver exploded to $49 and nearly broke the futures market that claimed to control it. Markets are loud when prices rise, but the real story is almost always written in the quiet moments, when something vanishes, and no one can explain why. And now, in 2025, the silence is cracking again. On February 14th, 4 major banks in South Korea halted all silver sales, without warning, without an end date. Not tomorrow, not next week, immediately. A move that echoed like a metallic click in a dark room, small, but unmistakably dangerous. China, at the same time, increased restrictions on citizens buying precious metals. Russia found itself pushed out of the London trading floors. And then the impossible happened. Spot silver, the price for metal in your hand, rose above futures prices. Backwardation, a quiet word in finance, but a thunderclap in reality. It means people trust the future so little that they will pay extra to get silver now, today, in their possession. That is not optimism. That is not speculation. That is fear. But this moment, this tightening, did not emerge from nowhere. It is part of an ancient pattern, a 4-stage cycle that has shaped economic eras from the Roman Empire to the modern age. When societies test the boundaries of trust, when paper claims grow faster than the real world beneath them, the cycle begins again. Stage 1 is stability. A commodity becomes money. A nation builds its trust on something physical, something finite. For decades, silver flowed through the everyday lives of Americans. Every coin jingling in a pocket was real metal, 90% silver until 1964. A person could walk into any bank with a paper dollar and walk out with silver because the promise and the substance were still connected. Then stage 2 begins. Manipulation. Someone, somewhere, realizes you can print paper far more easily than you can mine metal. So 1 ounce becomes 10 paper claims, then 50, then 100. Suddenly there is more silver in the market on screens, in contracts, in promises than the earth ever produced. The illusion is profitable. The reality is forgotten. But stage 3, the squeeze, always comes. Demand rises. People begin to ask for the real thing instead of settling for paper. Vaults empty faster than they fill. A collective realization spreads. There are more claims than ounces. And that realization, once it reaches the wrong people at the right moment, turns orderly markets into a stampede. And then stage 4, the break. The paper market collapses. Contracts default. Exchanges freeze. Delivery halts. The price becomes meaningless because the metal itself disappears from availability. Those holding physical silver win by survival, not speculation. Those holding promises learn what promises are worth. This pattern is not theory. It is history. And to understand the danger of this moment, we must revisit one of its most dramatic chapters. 1979, Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt, heirs to one of the largest oil fortunes in Texas, become convinced that the United States dollar is unraveling. Inflation is roaring. Nixon has already severed the last tie between money and gold. Fiat currency is spreading across the world. The Hunts decide silver, the oldest form of real money, is the Noah's Ark that will carry them through the coming storm. They buy aggressively. 200 million ounces. Half in physical form, half in futures. Silver rises from $6 to 10, then 30, then 49. Their wealth surges. Their influence terrifies Wall Street. Not because the Hunts were speculating, but because they were taking delivery. They were draining the vaults. Their futures contracts represented more claims on silver than the market could satisfy. And if they had continued demanding delivery, the entire futures system would have collapsed under its own promises. So the exchange changed the rules. Overnight, new rules forbade buying. Margin requirements skyrocketed. A coordinated financial chokehold. The Hunts scrambled. Prices plummeted. March 27th became known as Silver Thursday. The Hunts were destroyed financially. But here is the quiet truth. Those who simply held physical silver, ordinary people, outside leverage and outside the game, were not ruined. Even at $10 an ounce, silver was still dramatically above where the move began. The Hunts didn't fail because silver failed. They failed because they trusted a paper game run by people who could rewrite the rules. And that same structure exists today, only bigger, deeper, global. COMEX vaults hold 265 million ounces, yet only 43 million are actually registered for delivery. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of ounces exist as open paper claims. For decades, this imbalance was manageable because most traders settled in cash. But today, industrial users, sovereign buyers, retail investors, and entire nations are demanding physical silver at the same time. And the numbers are flashing red. Mining production has been declining since 2016. Demand has increased every single year since. The world ran a deficit of 148.9 million ounces in 2024, a gap between what humanity mined and what humanity consumed. Solar technology alone could drain nearly all remaining global silver reserves by 2050. Smartphones, electric vehicles, medical equipment, satellites, every cornerstone of the digital world draws deeper from a well that is slowly drying. But perhaps the most alarming sign arrived quietly. On November 17th, 6.13 million ounces disappeared from COMEX vaults in one day. A withdrawal of that magnitude has implications far beyond trading. It means major players, governments, industries, or institutions are taking silver out of the system entirely, reducing supply permanently. Then the banks stepped back. South Korea froze silver sales indefinitely. China restricted retail precious metal purchases. Dealers report rising premiums. Exchange-traded funds are absorbing enormous inflows. Retail shelves are thinning, and backwardation is becoming more common. These are not random events. These are symptoms of stage 3 tightening. The paper price does not match the physical reality. And in every historical episode, Athens, Rome, 1980, 2001, in Palladium, this divergence has foreshadowed the same ending. But before we reach that ending, something even larger is unfolding beneath the surface. While individuals scramble to secure physical silver, entire nations are repositioning their monetary foundations. The BRICS nations accumulate gold and silver quietly. China increases reserves. Central banks worldwide shift away from United States Treasury holdings. Currencies are being questioned. Debt loads have reached levels never before recorded in human history, and beneath that mountain of leverage, the smallest crack can trigger an avalanche. Silver is not the cause of the instability. Silver is the warning. And now, as we stand in the middle of stage 3, the world's paper promises are starting to tremble. Signs that were once isolated are merging into a single message. The system is under strain. And that strain grows because systems do not break at the moment of impact. They break slowly, then suddenly, through thousands of small fractures forming beneath the surface long before anyone sees the collapse. And silver, quietly, has become the measurement of those fractures. For decades, governments and global institutions treated silver as an afterthought, a relic of old coinage, a raw material for industry. But now the metal is being pulled in opposite directions. Technology demands more, investors demand more, nations demand more. Meanwhile, the earth offers less, and the financial system delivers even less than that. The gap between the real and the promised has become a widening fault line. And in that widening gap, something else is happening. Banks, usually the last entities to panic, are stepping away first. South Korea's sudden freeze on silver sales signaled more than inventory problems. Banks do not halt a product line important to customers without an underlying threat. Either the supply had dried up, or the risk of continuing to sell had become too great. China's restrictions were even more revealing. When a government limits citizen access to physical metals, it is not because the metal has lost relevance. It is because the state wants it for itself. China did the exact same thing with gold before major reserve announcements. By cutting off retail demand, they ensure the flow of metal moves in only one direction toward national stockpiles. And while this unfolds, COMEX vaults continue to shrink. 43 million registered ounces is not just a small number, it is an unstable number. One large industrial buyer could absorb that entire amount in a matter of months. The solar industry alone consumes more than that. Electric vehicle manufacturing consumes more than that. Nations stockpiling silver for strategic electronics consume more than that. The system now depends on the assumption that people will not ask for delivery. But history has shown, again and again, that once the desire for physical ownership begins, it does not reverse. It accelerates. That is why backwardation is a siren. When people pay more for immediate silver than future silver, the market is confessing its deepest fear. The metal might not be there tomorrow. In 1980, backwardation signaled the beginning of the end. In 2001, during the Palladium Crisis, backwardation struck just before prices soared more than 260%. Each time, the story was the same. The physical market revealed a truth the paper market tried to hide. And now in 2025, backwardation has returned, not as a brief anomaly, but as a recurring shadow stretching across the market. Yet silver is not merely an economic warning, it has become a geopolitical one. The BRICS coalition is quietly building a new trade settlement architecture backed at least partially by tangible assets. Gold is the centerpiece. But silver, due to its industrial dominance, is the infrastructure metal of the future. Any nation wanting technological independence must secure silver. Any nation wanting energy independence must secure silver. And any nation wanting immunity from Western financial leverage must secure silver. For decades, The world trusted the United States dollar as the central pillar of value. But trust is not an infinite resource. The national debt of the United States crossed levels once considered mathematically impossible. Interest payments surpassed military spending. And as the dollar weakens under its own weight, nations look for alternatives not out of ideology, but out of self-preservation. Silver, as humble as it seems, is part of that shift. Meanwhile, investors at the retail level, people far removed from geopolitical strategy, are noticing the same cracks. When premiums rise, when delivery times lengthen, when dealers struggle to source inventory, ordinary buyers sense what institutions often ignore. Something is tight. Something is stressed. Something is changing. The panic does not start with professionals. It starts with individuals seeing the shelves empty. And as the shelves empty, futures markets become increasingly fragile. A futures contract is a promise that the metal exists somewhere, waiting to be delivered. But what happens when the inventory supporting that promise shrinks faster than the contracts expand? The math breaks. When hundreds of millions of ounces exist as paper claims, but only tens of millions exist for delivery, the system depends entirely on one fragile assumption. Most people will never ask for the metal. When they do, even in small waves, the whole structure begins to shake. We are seeing those waves now. Silver exchange-traded funds are reporting inflows at levels not seen since 2011. Dealers are reporting shortages. Industrial buyers are negotiating long-term contracts earlier and earlier in the year. Mints are running at full capacity. Refiners are expanding operations. And yet, the deficit remains. The world is using more silver than it produces and has been for years. But perhaps the clearest signal comes from the technology sector. The more advanced human civilization becomes, the more dependent it becomes on silver. From the circuitry in autonomous vehicles to the heat dissipation layers in artificial intelligence servers, from the reflective coatings in satellites to the conductive films in solar infrastructure, silver is no longer optional. It is existential. If silver disappears, technology slows. If technology slows, power structures shift. This dynamic is not lost on the nations preparing for the next era of global competition. China, India, Russia, and Middle Eastern states are quietly accelerating their silver acquisition strategies. They are not waiting for the market to reveal its weakness. They are acting on what they already know. The world is crawling toward a collision point. And as silver tightens globally, the financial markets respond with denial. The futures markets insist that supply is adequate. Analysts insist that deficits can be solved. Politicians insist that inflation is temporary and that the monetary system is stable. But the metal moving out of vaults tells a different story. A story of scarcity, a story of urgency, a story of accelerating withdrawal. History teaches that when nations and institutions speak certainty, but the people who hold real assets behave with caution, the behavior is the truth. Words are strategy. Actions are confession. Right now, the confession is unmistakable. The world is accumulating silver at an accelerating pace. The physical supply is shrinking. The paper supply is growing. And the gap between what is promised and what is deliverable is stretching thinner each month. At some point, something snaps. But before that snap arrives, before the world crosses the line separating stability from crisis, we must examine something deeper, something that goes beyond markets, beyond mining, beyond economics. We must examine what happens psychologically when trust in a system begins to erode. Because once trust erodes, the behavior of nations, institutions, and individuals transforms in ways that cannot be reversed. And that transformation begins for one simple reason. Trust is not merely an idea. It is the invisible infrastructure holding entire civilizations in place. When trust weakens, nations overreact, markets distort, people panic, and history begins to rhyme in ways that are impossible to ignore. Throughout time, every monetary system has been built on a single foundation: belief. Belief that a piece of paper represents value, belief that banks will honor withdrawals, belief that a contract written today will be honored tomorrow. But belief is fragile. It decays quietly, like rust on an old steel beam. At first, everything looks intact. Then the structure groans. Then it bends. And finally, it collapses not because one blow was too strong, but because the metal underneath had already hollowed out. Silver is revealing that hollowing. When individuals buy silver, it is not because they suddenly became precious metal experts. It is because they feel something shifting beneath their feet. They sense inflation eating into their savings. They watch banks freeze accounts during crises. They hear politicians promise stability while the price of living rises year after year. Instinct whispers to them, find something real. When institutions buy silver, the reasoning is colder. They measure deficits. They compare industrial consumption against mining output. They model energy transitions and realize the numbers do not add up. They recognize that the demand curve is vertical while the supply curve is flattening. Their instinct is not fear, it is foresight. And when nations buy silver, the reasoning becomes strategic. They understand that control over physical resources determines geopolitical power. They see energy grids transforming. They see the dominance of artificial intelligence. They see warfare shifting to electronic and cyber realms. And they see that every one of these arenas requires silver. In every layer of society, from the ordinary citizen to the world's largest economies, the instinct to accumulate is emerging simultaneously. That is not normal. It is the signal of a system entering a new phase. But to understand the gravity of this moment, we must revisit an ancient truth. Scarcity changes behavior. In times of scarcity, people do not behave gradually. They reach tipping points. Their decisions shift suddenly and dramatically. When food becomes scarce, hoarding begins. When water becomes scarce, conflict erupts. When money becomes scarce, or more precisely, when real money becomes scarce, nations rewrite their financial DNA. That is what we are beginning to witness. Silver is no longer merely a metal. It has become a psychological barometer, a litmus test revealing what people truly believe about the future of money. And the belief gaining momentum is that the world is moving toward a monetary reset, one driven not by ideology or politics, but by physical limitations. And physical limitations do not negotiate. The modern world has been living under an illusion that digital abundance can compensate for physical scarcity, that printing currency can create wealth, that financial engineering can replace natural resources. But silver, because of its finite supply and irreplaceable properties, shatters that illusion. Once industrial demand collides with investment demand, and both collide with national accumulation, the market enters a phase no algorithm, no central bank, no futures contract can control. But beneath the economic story lies a deeper, more human one. For centuries, societies believed their monetary systems were permanent. Romans believed their silver coinage would last forever. The citizens of the British Empire believed the pound sterling was invincible. Americans believed the dollar, backed by military and global influence, was immovable. But no system has ever been immune to entropy, and entropy begins quietly, in small shifts of behavior. Citizens begin hoarding, banks begin restricting, nations begin accumulating, institutions begin hedging. These behaviors do not emerge from panic, they emerge from pattern recognition. And one of the strongest patterns is unfolding in the energy transition. The world is sprinting toward electrification. Solar panels, electric vehicles, battery infrastructure, telecommunication networks all require silver. Not occasionally, not marginally, fundamentally. An electric vehicle contains nearly twice the silver of a traditional combustion vehicle. A solar cell cannot function without silver paste. High-frequency communication equipment requires silver contacts. Artificial intelligence data centers require silver coatings for thermal regulation and conductivity. Every technological advancement humanity celebrates is welded, soldered, or wired with silver. At the same time, mining output is stagnating. Large, easy-to-access silver deposits have already been exhausted. New mines take years, even decades, to develop. Environmental regulations tighten, capex rises, ore grades decline. The silver extracted today is often a byproduct of other metals, not a primary mining target, meaning supply cannot quickly respond to demand. This imbalance is not temporary, it is structural. And yet the futures market continues to behave as though silver is abundant, as though all physical deficits can be solved with keystrokes, as though promises have the same weight as atoms. But atoms are uncompromising. Even now, beneath the radar of mainstream news, industries are fighting quietly over long-term silver supply. Renewable energy companies are attempting to lock in contracts years in advance. Electronics manufacturers are negotiating for allocation before mines even reach full production. Governments are preemptively securing strategic reserves. These pressures do not unfold linearly, they build until something breaks. And that breaking point becomes visible long before the collapse arrives. Silver dealers reporting lower inventory is one sign, vaults emptying is another. Banks withdrawing from participation is a third. Backwardation is a fourth. Rising premiums, a fifth. Accelerating national accumulation, a sixth. Each sign alone can be dismissed. Together, they tell a story. A story of a market transitioning from abundance to scarcity. A story of trust slipping into uncertainty. A story of a monetary structure strained under the weight of its own contradictions. But perhaps the most revealing story is the one unfolding within the financial institutions themselves. Because while the public watches headlines about inflation and interest rates, banks and funds are confronting a deeper problem. The liquidity of the metals market is not what it appears to be. Liquidity is an illusion when the underlying asset is disappearing. And at this moment, liquidity is evaporating. Large players who once relied on futures markets for hedging are now quietly moving into physical acquisition. These institutions understand a principle rarely spoken aloud, A hedge only works if the asset behind it exists. Without physical metal, futures become empty promises. As more institutional buyers demand physical settlement, the strain on the system intensifies. And once industrial users begin doing the same, a feedback loop emerges, one that cannot be reversed easily because each withdrawal permanently reduces the pool of available silver. Meanwhile, the psychology of the public continues to shift. The more people recognize cracks in the monetary system, the more they search for something tangible. And the more they search, the more they accelerate the shortage. Scarcity feeding scarcity. Fear feeding behavior. Behavior feeding reality. This feedback loop is how Stage 3 evolves into Stage 4. But before Stage 4 arrives, before the break, before the collapse, before the system resets, there is a transitional phase that is rarely discussed. A phase where nations quietly maneuver behind closed doors, preparing for a world where the monetary order looks very different from the one we inherited. In this transitional phase, silver is not simply a metal. It becomes a strategic asset, a lever for negotiation, a buffer against financial sanctions, a tool for maintaining technological independence, and a shield against inflation driven by excessive money creation. But deeper than strategy lies necessity. Modern civilization cannot function without silver. From the lights that illuminate our cities to the satellites guiding our maps, from medical imaging machines to the infrastructure enabling artificial intelligence, every system relies on silver. If silver becomes scarce, the world does not simply slow down. It fractures. Energy grids falter. Supply chains destabilize. Technological progress stagnates. Nations that secured silver continue advancing. Nations that did not fall behind. This is a scenario no government wants to admit aloud, yet many are preparing for silently. And as these preparations intensify, the tension between the physical and paper markets grows sharper. The futures market may continue projecting stability, but the physical market tells a story of accelerating strain. A strain that is pushing the world toward an inflection point. And like all inflection points in history, it will not be recognized in the moment. It will be understood only in hindsight, when people look back and say, it was obvious, the signs were everywhere. Why didn't more people act? But before that hindsight arrives, before the market crosses a line it cannot uncross, there is one more deeply revealing force we must examine, one that connects economics, psychology, and geopolitics in a single, undeniable thread. The force of monetary displacement? Because when people and nations begin shifting from a failing monetary structure into a new one, the shift begins quietly, invisibly, long before the world realizes. And it begins this way for a reason. Monetary displacement is never loud. It does not announce itself with a crisis headline or a sudden market crash. Instead, it emerges as a quiet migration value slipping away from one system and accumulating in another. A shift that never starts at the top but at the edges, with individuals, with small institutions, with subtle patterns that only become visible once the movement is already irreversible. And silver has become one of those destinations, one of the final receivers of displaced trust. When a monetary system weakens, the first thing people seek is not profit, it is safety. Profit is a luxury of stable eras. Safety is the priority of transitional eras. And the world, right now, is unmistakably entering a transitional era. We see this migration in behavior, not in speeches. Nations speak confidence but act cautiously. Banks speak stability but reduce exposure. Investors speak optimism but accumulate hedges. Meanwhile, physical silver, once forgotten, is being pulled from the system at a speed that contradicts every official narrative. This is what monetary displacement looks like. It begins quietly, then accelerates, then reaches a tipping point where the flow of trust becomes a flood. But beneath this shift lies a deeper truth. People are beginning to question whether the structure of modern finance is built on anything real, whether the numbers on screens represent value or simply belief, whether trillions in derivatives represent assets or potential liabilities waiting to surface, and silver, being physical, finite, irreplaceable, exposes that doubt. Because unlike paper wealth, which can be printed, extended, borrowed, or refinanced, silver does not bend, it does not inflate, it does not default. When everything else becomes abstract, silver remains stubbornly concrete. That concreteness is becoming valuable again. But the transition unfolding now is not merely economic, it is philosophical. For decades, the world embraced a narrative that material scarcity no longer mattered, that technology, banking innovation, and financial engineering could solve any shortage. But nature disagrees. Physics disagrees. Silver disagrees. And when nature contradicts ideology, nature wins. This is why the unfolding silver squeeze is not simply a market event. It is a moment of collective recognition, a moment when people realize that the promises holding modern finance together are only as strong as the resources behind them. When those resources weaken, so does the system. But silver is only one piece of a larger transformation. Around the world, monetary displacement is accelerating in multiple directions simultaneously. Gold reserves rising, debt to GDP ratios exploding, currencies losing purchasing power, energy grids struggling under new demand, technological expansion consuming more resources than the planet can replenish. The monetary system is not collapsing from a single event. It is being eroded by a convergence of pressures, each one sharpening the next, and silver sits at the intersection of all of them. It touches energy, electronics, finance, geopolitics, military strategy, and the psychology of trust. Few assets in history have played such a multidimensional role. Even gold, despite its timeless monetary importance, does not share silver's industrial indispensability. This gives silver a unique position in the unfolding reset. But to understand where this leads, we must examine how displacement unfolds inside institutions, because institutions are designed to appear calm even when under extreme stress. Inside major banks, the conversations have changed. Risk departments are reviewing precious metal exposure more frequently. Physical settlement requests, once rare, are becoming more common. Large clients are asking questions they never asked before. Is the metal actually there? What happens if delivery becomes impossible? What is our counterparty exposure? These questions are not hypothetical. They're warnings. Inside hedge funds and asset managers, silver's role is shifting from trade to hedge and from hedge to strategic reserve. Portfolio managers are quietly instructing their analysts to evaluate physical allocation rather than derivatives. Even institutions that publicly dismiss metals as archaic are acquiring them quietly. Inside governments, the calculus is more urgent. Nations racing to secure their energy transitions cannot afford disruptions in silver supply. A shortage in copper or nickel would slow progress. A shortage in silver would stop it. And stopping the energy transition means destabilizing the economy of the future. Governments do not publicize these concerns, but their actions reveal them. Procurement contracts, mining partnerships, diplomatic agreements, each movement points toward a shared fear. The next era of civilization cannot function without an adequate silver supply. This is not financial speculation. It is infrastructural necessity. And that necessity is why silver is being pulled into national strategies. But even deeper than public institutions is another layer: military strategy. The modern battlefield is electronic. Surveillance, communication, targeting, navigation, encryption all depend on silver-based components. A nation lacking silver faces not only technological decline, but military vulnerability. This is why rumors circulate about certain countries securing silver quietly through intermediaries, refusing to appear publicly in the market. They do not want to signal scarcity. They do not want to accelerate the panic. But they want the metal, and the more nations behave this way, the more strained the physical market becomes. This leads to the next stage of monetary displacement: competitive accumulation. It is no longer about hedging. It is about securing strategic advantage. Nations competing, industries competing, investors competing. And when competition emerges in a finite market, scarcity accelerates at an exponential rate. This is where the story stops being about silver and starts being about global power. Because once the world realizes that physical silver cannot meet the demands of energy, technology, and investment simultaneously, the competition will intensify. And as competition intensifies, prices will disconnect from paper models entirely. But before that break happens, the psychology of markets undergoes a transformation. People stop trusting price, they start trusting availability. And availability becomes the real measure of value. This is why premiums rise even when spot prices remain flat. It's why wait times grow even when futures show stability. It's why governments restrict silver access even when official reports claim supply is adequate. Availability is diverging from price. This divergence is what precedes volatility. And volatility precedes structural change. But structural change is never smooth. It comes in waves. The first wave is denial. Analysts claim inventories are temporarily low. That supply will rebound. That industrial demand is overstated. That futures markets remain healthy. The second wave is rationalization. Blame shifts to geopolitical tensions, to mining strikes, to logistic bottlenecks, to temporary market imbalances. The third wave is realization. This is when institutions begin scrambling for long-term supply, when nations tighten export controls, when backwardation becomes chronic rather than occasional, when silver ceases to be just another metal and becomes a priority. And then the fourth wave, acceleration. The moment demand surges faster than the market can respond. The moment futures markets detach from physical reality. The moment the pricing mechanism itself begins to distort. We are somewhere between wave 2 and wave 3, not at the beginning. not at the end. At the turning point, but what comes next will not be defined by investors or analysts. It will be defined by necessity, industrial necessity, technological necessity, military necessity, monetary necessity. Because the world is approaching a resource bottleneck, one that cannot be resolved with policy, interest rates, digital currencies, or financial engineering. It can only be resolved with metal, real, physical metal, and that realization is spreading faster than the supply can replenish. Which leads to the question almost no one is asking aloud. What happens when silver shifts from being a market commodity to being a strategic priority for nations? What happens when governments begin competing with corporations for supply? What happens when industries begin competing with investors for scarcity? What happens when scarcity reaches a point where the market no longer controls the metal, but the metal controls the market? These questions are not theoretical. They form the outline of what comes next. Because as monetary displacement accelerates, as nations reposition, as trust erodes, and as physical shortages tighten, the global financial system drifts closer to a threshold it does not yet recognize. A threshold where price becomes irrelevant, where availability becomes destiny, and where silver becomes not just a resource but a foundation for the next era of global power. And every global shift in history eventually reaches such a moment when the illusion dissolves and the truth steps into the light, a moment when people stop debating numbers and finally see the structure behind them. A moment when the world realizes it has crossed a threshold, not because someone declared it, but because there is no turning back. Silver is leading us toward that moment. For years, the financial system has behaved as though physical scarcity can be ignored, postponed, or replaced with abstraction, as though printing, modeling, or legislating value can substitute for the finite resources that make modern life possible. But the world is now rediscovering a reality ancient civilizations once knew instinctively. You cannot build the future on promises. You can only build it on what is real. And silver, more than gold, more than oil, more than any single resource, is revealing what remains real in a world drifting toward uncertainty. We stand at the edge of a monetary era defined not by ideology, but by consequence. Nations have borrowed beyond repayment. Currencies have inflated beyond trust. Markets have promised more than they can deliver. Technology has demanded more than the earth can provide. And beneath it all, people quietly at first, then noticeably have begun searching for anchors. That search leads back to something humanity has always returned to in moments of transition: tangible value. Not because it is old, not because it is traditional, but because it is the only thing that survives the collapse of illusions. Silver is becoming that anchor again, not through propaganda, not through speculation, but through the slow, undeniable convergence of necessity and scarcity. History's greatest monetary resets share the same pattern. First comes expansion, then comes distortion, then comes denial, and finally, reality breaks through. When it does, those who moved early do not merely preserve their wealth, they preserve their options, their freedom, their ability to navigate the world after the reset. Because a reset is not the end. It is the clearing of a path. What is ending now is trust in the ability of paper systems to deliver physical value. What is beginning is a revaluation, a global awakening to the importance of real assets in a digitally inflated world. When future historians look back at this decade, they will not see a silver shortage or a banking freeze or a commodities squeeze as isolated events. They will see a pattern, a shift in collective behavior, a subtle migration of trust from the intangible to the tangible. They will write that people, after decades of believing in infinite growth, finally realized that physical limits do not negotiate, that a world built on technology must respect the materials that make technology possible, that the monetary systems of the 21st century were forced, at last, to reconnect with the reality they had floated above for far too long. And they will write that silver, quiet, overlooked silver was one of the first signals of that reconnection. But this story is not about fear. It is about responsibility. It is about awareness, about recognizing patterns that history has repeated again and again for those willing to see them. Because the truth is simple. In times of abundance, paper wealth feels real. In times of scarcity, only real wealth matters. We are entering the latter. The window is still open, though narrower than before. A window not just to buy metal, but to understand the world more clearly, to see through the noise, to hear what the markets themselves are whispering, to recognize that beneath every chart, every headline, every price, there is a deeper force shaping the next chapter of global finance. And that force is already in motion. The question that remains now is not whether the break will come. History has already answered that. The question is who will be prepared when it does. Who will understand that the decisions made before a turning point matter far more than the decisions made after? Because once the break arrives, once the contracts freeze, Once the shelves empty, once the physical market disconnects from paper entirely, the opportunity does not just shrink, it disappears, as it always has, for thousands of years. So as we close this chapter, this examination of silver, scarcity, and the slow unraveling beneath our financial systems, remember one truth that every empire, every dynasty, every civilization eventually learned. When the world shifts, wealth does not vanish, it only changes hands. And the people who recognize the shift early, the people who prepare not out of fear but out of clarity, are the ones who do not just survive the reset. They shape what comes after. The clock is ticking, the pattern is unfolding, and the window is still open. For now,